Barron Trump disguises as a struggling worker. The White House staff's treatment exposed. The Grand Hall of the White House Conference Center buzzed with energy as CEOs, politicians, and high-ranking officials milled about, sipping expensive champagne and exchanging smug conversations about their latest successes. The event was an exclusive leadership summit, a gathering of the most powerful decision-makers in the country, where wealth and influence dictated everything. Among the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses, a young man in a janitor's uniform moved quietly through the crowd, pushing a cleaning cart. His dark blue work shirt was slightly wrinkled, the sleeves rolled up to reveal calloused hands. His name tag read Ben. No one paid him any attention. To them, he was invisible. Just another worker tasked with cleaning up after the elite. But he was watching, listening, and soon they would regret underestimating him. Because the man disguised as Ben the janitor was actually Barron Trump. Barron had always been curious about how people truly behaved when they thought no one important was watching. He had grown up in the most powerful family in the world, surrounded by wealth and status, but he had always questioned the authenticity of the people in these circles. Were they really as respectable as they claimed to be? Or did they only respect power? Tonight, he was going to find out. Dressed in the uniform of a low-ranking staff member, he moved unnoticed through the crowd, pretending to polish silver trays and wipe down tables. The conference was supposed to be about leadership, ethics, and the future of American industries, but as Barron eavesdropped on the conversations around him, he quickly realized the truth was far different. At one table, a group of executives from a major tech company laughed as they discussed layoffs that had doubled their profits. I mean, let's be honest, one of them sneered. Do we really need that many employees? AI is cheaper, and unlike people, it doesn't whine about working conditions. Barron's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. At another table, a CEO from a luxury hotel chain scoffed as he recounted firing an employee who had requested time off for a family emergency. You give them an inch, and they take a mile, he muttered. Honestly, workers today are too soft. A nearby senator chuckled in agreement. You're right, he said. That's why I'm pushing for policies that make it harder for these people to demand higher wages. If they don't like it, they can find another job. Barron's grip tightened on the rag in his hand. So this is how they talk when they think no one important is listening. It wasn't about leadership. It wasn't about ethics. It was about power, and the belief that those without it didn't matter. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. They still had no idea who he really was. And when the truth finally came out, it would be too late. As Barron continued wiping down tables, he accidentally bumped into one of the servers carrying a tray of champagne. The tray wobbled, and a single glass tipped over, splashing onto the suit of a wealthy oil executive standing nearby. There was a moment of tense silence. The executive's face turned red with rage. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, brushing at his now stained sleeve. "I'm sorry, sir," Barron mumbled, keeping his head down, playing the part of a lowly worker. The executive scoffed. "Of course you are. You low-class idiots are all the same, useless and incompetent." A few of the nearby guests laughed. Barron stayed silent. Then, the executive turned to one of the event organizers. "Who hired this trash? Get him out of here." Barron felt the weight of every eye in the room turn to him. Whispers. Judging looks. He was nothing to them. Just a worker. Just a nobody. But then, a voice cut through the room. "Is there a problem here?" The room froze. Because standing in the doorway, watching the entire scene unfold, was Melania Trump. Barron lifted his head slightly, finally letting a hint of who he really was slip through. The executive paled. The laughter stopped. Because in an instant, they all realized their mistake. And their careers would never recover from it. The air in the conference room shifted instantly. The laughter died. The condescending smirks faded. Every executive, senator, and CEO in the room froze in place, their expressions flickering between confusion and panic as they registered who was now watching them. Melania Trump stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor, her gaze locked onto the scene in front of her. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. The weight of her presence alone was enough to send a ripple of unease through the crowd. Barron remained still, his janitor's disguise suddenly feeling heavier under the realization that his test was about to reach its peak. He had come here to see the truth for himself. And now? It was time for them to realize their mistake. Melania's sharp gaze swept over the stunned faces before landing on the oil executive, who was still brushing at the champagne stain on his expensive suit, too flustered to process what was happening. "You seem upset," Melania said smoothly, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. The executive swallowed hard. "Mrs. Trump, I..." She raised a hand, silencing him. "I heard everything." The executive's mouth snapped shut. His face drained of color. Barron slowly straightened, no longer slouching like the invisible worker they had dismissed. The staff, the executives, the high-ranking guests who had been so quick to laugh at him just moments ago, now stared at him in wide-eyed horror. They knew. They knew they had just humiliated the son of a former president of the United States. And now, their own words would be their downfall. One of the event organizers stepped forward hastily, his forehead already shining with sweat. "Mrs. Trump, this is a misunderstanding. We had no idea." "No idea of what?" Melania interrupted coolly. "That the young man you just degraded is my son? Or that you openly mock and dismiss those who work hard for a living?" Silence. Barron let the moment stretch, watching as their arrogance crumbled. A woman, a well-known CEO of a billion-dollar retail company, cleared her throat nervously. We were just joking, of course." "No harm intended." Barron's lips curled slightly. "No harm intended?" he repeated, his voice smooth but icy. "That's interesting. Because not 5 minutes ago, I was useless and incompetent." The room was so silent you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Melania took another step forward, her piercing gaze settling on the oil executive. "You," she said, her tone like steel. The man visibly flinched. "What is your name?" she asked. He hesitated. "Mark Weller, ma'am." Melania nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "And you are the CEO of?" Mark's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Western Energy Holdings." Melania turned to Barron, then back to Mark. "So you believe that people like my son, like the workers who clean your offices, cook your food, and drive your cars, are beneath you?" Mark didn't answer, because there was nothing he could say that would save him now. The damage was done. Barron looked around, taking in the expressions of panic, regret, and sheer terror. "How interesting," Barron mused, finally stepping into his full height. His usual quiet demeanor was gone. He stood with the full weight of who he truly was, letting them see him not as a worker, but as a Trump. He turned to his mother, his voice smooth but cutting. "I think we just learned exactly what kind of leaders we have in this room." Melania nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Indeed we have." Barron glanced around at the crowd, locking eyes with each person who had belittled him, who had laughed at his mistakes, who had looked at him as if he was nothing. "Do you know what the funny thing is?" he asked, tilting his head. "I came here tonight to see if these people, these so-called leaders, were as inspiring and respectable as they pretend to be." He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Turns out they're just cowards who worship money and power. And the second they realize they've insulted someone with influence, they scramble like cockroaches." A few nervous gasps rippled through the room. A senator near the back shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact. The event organizer, still pale, looked like he might faint. Barron took a slow step forward, his gaze locking onto Mark Weller, the man who had humiliated him moments ago. "I wonder," Barron mused, "how your board of directors will feel about this. Or your shareholders." Mark blanched. It's a misunderstanding," Mark stammered. Of course, I respect all workers." Barron raised an eyebrow. "You mean the ones who don't accidentally spill champagne on your sleeve?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Melania exhaled, shaking her head. "No need to lie now, Mr. Weller. We all heard you. The media will hear you too." Mark staggered slightly, his mind clearly racing. "Please, Mrs. Trump." But Melania had already turned away. "I do not waste my time on men who lack character." With that, she looked at Barron. "Shall we go?" Barron smirked. casting one last glance at the room full of elites who had just destroyed their own careers. "I think we've seen enough." And with that, the Trumps walked out. By morning, headlines would explode. White House CEOs humiliate worker at leadership summit, then realize he's Barron Trump. Elite executives mock staff, unaware they're insulting a Trump. CEO of Western Energy Holdings under fire for classist remarks. Board considers removal. The fallout was immediate. The companies involved faced boycotts, investor withdrawals, and public outrage. Executives were forced to resign. And one by one, the people who had laughed at Barron fell from grace. Meanwhile, Barron? He didn't even have to say a word. They had exposed themselves. And now, the world would never forget. The morning after the disastrous conference, the world woke up to a scandal that no amount of PR spin could fix. The video of the event, Barron Trump, disguised as a struggling worker, being openly humiliated by CEOs and politicians, had gone viral overnight. Major news outlets ran the story on every channel. Elites at White House event mock janitor, only to discover he's Barron Trump. Billionaire executives exposed for disrespecting workers, now facing career ruin. Melania Trump witnesses workplace discrimination firsthand. What she says next shocks everyone. Social media exploded. The hypocrisy, the arrogance, the complete disregard for working-class people, it was all on display for the world to see. The public reaction was instant. Customers boycotted companies whose executives had been caught on camera sneering at Barron. Stock prices plummeted as investors rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. And within hours, corporate boards were holding emergency meetings to address the crisis. But for the men and women who had mocked Barron Trump, it was already too late. Inside Western Energy Holdings, the atmosphere was pure chaos. Mark Weller sat at the head of a long conference table, his face ashen as he watched the headlines roll in. His PR team, legal advisors, and executives talked over each other, scrambling for a solution. "We need to get ahead of this," one of them barked. "Issue a public apology." "Apology?" another scoffed. "Do you really think that's going to fix this? We're already trending worldwide for all the wrong reasons." Mark's hands clenched into fists. "How bad is the damage?" The CFO adjusted his glasses, his voice grim. "Our stocks are already down 15% and dropping. Shareholders are demanding an explanation." Mark's stomach twisted. "Investors are backing out," the legal advisor added. "And the board?" He hesitated. Mark's eyes snapped up. "What about the board?" The legal advisor exhaled. "They're discussing removing you as CEO." Mark's heart dropped. But this couldn't be happening. He had built this company. He had made them billions. And now? Now they wanted to throw him away? Over one mistake? His mind raced. There had to be a way to fix this. But before he could speak, his assistant rushed into the room. "You need to see this," she said, breathless, holding up her phone. Mark snatched it, his eyes scanning the screen. And then, his blood ran cold. Because staring back at him was a statement from Melania Trump herself. "What I witnessed at last night's event was a disgrace. Leaders are meant to uplift those around them, not tear them down for their own amusement. Respect should not be given based on wealth, but on character. My son's experience only proved what many hardworking Americans already know, that too many in power see them as disposable. Let this be a lesson. The true test of leadership is not in how you treat those you see as equals, but in how you treat those you believe have nothing to offer you." And last night, many failed that test. I have no doubt that the consequences of their actions will be swift and deserved. Because, as we have all seen, the world is watching. Melania Trump. The words hit like a sledgehammer. There was no apology that could undo this. No statement that could spin it. The First Lady of the United States had spoken. And her voice carried power. Mark let the phone slip from his hands. Because in that moment he knew his career was over. Across the country, one by one, the men and women who had humiliated Barron Trump were facing their downfall. The CEO of the luxury hotel chain who had bragged about firing an employee in need, fired himself. His own board removed him within 48 hours, stating that his actions didn't align with company values. The tech executive who had laughed about laying off workers to increase profits? His company's biggest investors pulled out, causing catastrophic losses. And Mark Weller? The man who had called Barron useless and incompetent? He was given the choice to resign or be forcibly removed. He chose to resign. But it didn't matter, because his reputation was already destroyed. Meanwhile, Barron Trump sat in his study, watching it all unfold. He had expected backlash, but even he hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly. His mother's statement had sealed their fate, and the public made sure there was no coming back from it. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was strange. He hadn't set out to ruin anyone. He had only wanted to see how these so-called leaders truly behaved. And now, the world had seen the truth. They had exposed themselves. And no amount of power, money, or influence could save them now. He reached for his phone, scrolling through the flood of reactions online. Some people were calling for industry-wide reform. Others were celebrating the instant karma. And then there were those who had learned something deeper. One comment caught his eye. "I work a minimum wage job, and I've always felt like people in power don't see us as human. Watching Barron Trump expose them like this, it gives me hope. Maybe real change is possible." Barron stared at the words for a long moment. Maybe it was possible. Maybe this was just the beginning. He locked his phone, standing up and glancing out the window at the city below. Because while some people had just lost everything, he had gained something more valuable than power. He had proven that character, not wealth, was what truly mattered. And the world would never forget it. The fallout from the conference continued to escalate, reaching far beyond what any of the executives involved had expected. News outlets relentlessly covered the scandal, dissecting every recorded insult, every dismissive remark, every moment of arrogance that had been displayed when they believed they were speaking only among their own kind. One by one, executives issued statements of apology. But no one believed them. Their words were too rehearsed, too calculated, obviously written by PR teams scrambling to salvage what little remained of their reputations. And the public? The public wasn't buying it. Boycotts spread like wildfire. Shareholders demanded resignations. The companies that had once thrived on the backs of hardworking employees were now struggling as customers turned their backs. It was poetic justice, and Barron Trump had barely spoken a word. Inside the White House, Melania Trump watched the news coverage with quiet satisfaction. She had always known that true power wasn't about how much money you had. It was about character. And that's exactly what had been exposed. The people who had believed themselves to be untouchable, who had mocked those beneath them without fear of consequence, had learned a brutal lesson. Because, in the end, the world had been watching. Meanwhile, Barron sat in his study, scrolling through the flood of messages, articles, and social media reactions. For every comment mocking the downfall of the arrogant CEOs, there were twice as many from workers, people who had spent their entire lives feeling invisible, unheard, dismissed. Finally, someone exposed them for what they really are. "I've worked in hospitality for 20 years, and this is exactly how they treat us. I hope this changes things. We deserve better." Barron exhaled, setting his phone down. He had started this as a personal experiment, a way to see how these so-called leaders treated people they believed were beneath them. But what he had uncovered was bigger than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about him. This was about an entire system of power built on arrogance and greed. And now, that system was starting to crack. At Western Energy Holdings, the boardroom was in chaos. Mark Weller sat at the long, polished table, his hands clasped tightly together as his executives shouted over each other. "We're losing investors by the hour," one of them snapped. "The public trust in us is completely destroyed," another added. Mark gritted his teeth. "Then we fix it?" The CFO scoffed. "Fix it? How do you propose we do that? We can't undo what's been said." Silence fell over the room. Because they all knew the truth. There was no coming back from this. The damage was irreversible. And then, the words Mark had been dreading finally came. "We're calling for your resignation." Mark's stomach dropped. His own company, the empire he had spent decades building, was now kicking him out. For the first time in his life, he was the one being discarded. And the worst part? He had done this to himself. Across the country, one by one, the powerful figures involved faced similar fates. The hotel CEO? Forced to step down. The tech executive? Publicly humiliated, his company's board replacing him overnight. The senator who had joked about suppressing wages? Now facing massive public outrage and a formal ethics investigation. Their downfall was swift and brutal. And Barron? He didn't even need to lift a finger. They had destroyed themselves. Weeks later, Barron sat across from his mother in a private dining room in the White House. Melania studied him carefully. "You've been quiet." Barron sipped his tea. "I've been watching." Melania nodded, waiting. Finally, Barron leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I didn't expect it to be this big." His mother smirked slightly. "That's because you underestimated the power of the truth." Barron thought about that for a moment. "You did well," Melania added, her tone softer. Barron shook his head. "I didn't really do anything." Melania arched an eyebrow. "Didn't you?" He had gone into that conference disguised as someone with no power, someone the elite would feel comfortable degrading. And in doing so, he had revealed their true nature. He had proven that respect, in their world, wasn't given, it was bought. And when the money was stripped away, so was the illusion. "I never had to say a word," Barron murmured. Melania's eyes gleamed. "That's what made it so powerful." Barron looked out the window, watching as the city moved on, forever changed by what had happened. He had always been curious about how the world worked, about the people who ran it. But he had seen the truth. And so had everyone else. In the weeks following the scandal, the world had changed in ways no one had expected. The men and women who had once mocked workers, laughed at the struggling, and treated those beneath them as disposable were now the ones fighting for survival. Their careers were over. No company wanted to be associated with them. No investor wanted to touch them. Their names had become synonymous with greed, arrogance, and corruption. Meanwhile, the public discourse had shifted. Workers across industries, hospitality, retail, corporate offices began speaking up. People who had once been afraid to call out the mistreatment they endured felt empowered. They weren't just employees anymore. They were witnesses. And the world? The world was finally listening. Inside the White House, Barron Trump sat in the private library, staring at the news reports scrolling across the television screen. It still felt surreal. He had never set out to start a movement. He had just wanted to see the truth for himself. But now the truth was out. And no one could ignore it. The door to the library opened, and Melania Trump stepped inside. She watched her son for a moment before taking a seat across from him. "You look troubled," she observed. Barron exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I didn't expect all of this." Melania studied him, then asked, "Are you proud of what you've done?" Barron hesitated before nodding. "I am." Melania tilted her head. "Then why do you seem unsure?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because it's bigger than I thought it would be." Melania offered a small smile. "That's what happens when you expose the truth. It doesn't just change a moment, it changes everything." Barron looked at her, taking in her words. She was right. This wasn't just about one event, one scandal. This was about how the world worked. And now that it had been exposed, people wouldn't accept the old way of things anymore. The door opened again, and an aide stepped inside. "Mr. Trump, you have a visitor." Barron frowned. "A visitor?" The aide nodded. "A representative from Western Energy Holdings." "He's requesting a meeting." Melania raised an eyebrow, watching her son carefully. "Are you going to hear him out?" Barron thought for a moment. Then, with a smirk, he stood up. "Let's see what he has to say." Mark Weller sat in one of the smaller conference rooms inside the White House, his posture tense as he waited for Barron to arrive. Just weeks ago, he had been at the top of the world. A powerful CEO, untouchable, respected. But he was a man desperately trying to salvage what little he had left. The door opened, and Barron Trump stepped inside. No longer the silent, unseen worker they had dismissed. But he was the man who had ended their careers. Mark stood immediately, clearing his throat. "Mr. Trump." Barron didn't offer a handshake. He simply sat down, folding his hands on the table. Mark hesitated before sitting as well. I appreciate you taking the time to see me. Barron smirked slightly. That's interesting. You didn't appreciate my presence at the conference? Mark flinched. But I made a mistake. Barron leaned back. A mistake? Mark nodded quickly. I never meant any harm. It was a misunderstanding. And now, my company is suffering. I wanted to talk about... Barron cut him off. You mean you want a way out? Mark swallowed hard. I want to fix this. Barron studied him. Really studied him. He wasn't here because he had changed. He was here because he had lost everything. Barron tapped his fingers on the table. Tell me something, Mr. Weller. If I had really been just a janitor that night, would you be sitting here right now? Mark hesitated. But I don't know. Barron smirked. I do. Mark looked away. Barron stood up. You're not here to fix anything. You're here because you lost. And people like you only care about power. But now, you don't have any. Mark's face turned red. Is there anything I can do? Barron considered it for a moment. Then, with a small smile, he said, You can leave. Mark stiffened. Barron turned and walked away. And with that, the last piece of the old world crumbled. As Barron stepped out of the conference room, he found his mother waiting for him. She studied his expression. How did it go? Barron smirked. Exactly how I thought it would. Melania nodded. Good. They walked down the hall together, the weight of what had been done settling into something more permanent. This wasn't just a moment in time. This was a shift in power. And the world would never be the same.